The morning after my husband's funeral, I came home to find my father-in-law crouched by the door, replacing the locks. I stood on that curb for what felt like an hour, but was likely only minutes, watching the oak door, the one I had sanded and stained myself the first summer we moved in, remain stubbornly shut against me, a physical barrier between my life and the void I was suddenly falling into. I didn't scream, and I didn't pound on the wood until my fists bled, because the part of my brain that was still functioning, the cold, reptilian survivor part, whispered that giving Robert the satisfaction of a public breakdown was a currency I could not afford to spend. Instead, I walked back to my car, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else, and drove to a Motel 6 on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the sheets smell of industrial bleach and despair, and I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the stucco ceiling, realizing that I was a 32-year-old widow with $14 in cash, a maxed-out credit card from the funeral costs Robert promised to reimburse and never did, and no home. The first night was a fugue state of grief and panic, a terrifying oscillation between weeping for Mark and hyperventilating about survival. But as the sun rose, casting a sickly yellow light through the polyester curtains, the grief began to calcify into something harder, something sharp and dangerous. They had made a critical error, one born of their own arrogance. They assumed that because Mark was soft-hearted, he was also foolish, and by extension, that I was helpless without him to translate the world for me. They forgot that while Mark was the dreamer, I was the one who managed the logistics, the one who double-checked the tax returns, the one who kept the files, and they forgot that Mark, for all his love for them, was terrified of his father's controlling nature. I reached into my purse and pulled out my keychain, my fingers trembling as I isolated a small, nondescript silver key that hung next to the car fob. 2 years ago, after a particularly brutal argument where Robert had threatened to cut Mark out of the will for spending Thanksgiving with my parents, Mark had driven me to a bank 3 towns over, not our usual branch, and opened a safety deposit box. He had looked me in the eye, his face pale and serious, and said, "If anything ever happens to me and they try to pull their usual games, you come here. Promise me." I had laughed it off then, telling him he was being dramatic, but now, holding that key, I felt a jolt of connection to him so strong it almost brought me to my knees. He was still protecting me, reaching out from beyond the veil to hand me a weapon. I drove to the bank with a singular, terrifying focus, ignoring the barrage of text messages from Eleanor that alternated between faux concern, "We are worried about your mental state. Please let us know you are safe," and blatant threats. "If you return to the property, we will call the police." When the bank manager ushered me into the vault and left me alone with the long metal box, I opened it with a prayer caught in my throat. Inside, there wasn't a fortune in diamonds or cash. There was a single, thick manila envelope labeled "Insurance" in Mark's jagged, lefty scrawl. I tore it open, and as I read the documents inside, the air in the vault seemed to rush back into my lungs. Mark hadn't just paid back the loan. He had known his father well enough to anticipate this exact scenario. Inside the envelope was the original promissory note, stamped "Paid in full" in red ink, alongside a notarized "Release of Leanne" that Robert had signed 3 years ago, but crucially had never filed with the county clerk, likely keeping it in his pocket as leverage. But there was more. There was a letter, handwritten by Mark, dated 6 months ago when his headaches started. It detailed the repayment, the dates, the check numbers, and specifically stated, "My father, Robert Hawthorne, has a history of financial manipulation. Let this letter serve as an affidavit that I owe him nothing, and that my home is jointly owned with my wife, to whom I leave everything." And underneath that, a thumb drive containing audio recordings of conversations Mark had secretly taped. Conversations where Robert admitted the loan was cleared, but laughed about keeping the leverage over that girl's head.
Full story on channel link below.